Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is, well, what shall we call this one? Let's say it's Monday, July 22nd, just for the sake of argument, and that it is time for another show, and that I have brought you another show, and it follows. Well, it sort of does. Pre-recorded, of course, and we'll put together, a couple of shortened specials for you here during the week, during which I will be away touring part of the fabulous west of the United States, enjoying the scenery, I hope, enjoying some maybe drier weather than we have in the swamps of Virginia, and bringing you a couple of stories that I think, or I hope, will either still be fresh or evergreen, such that they might be worthy of your time in the morning. Yeah, I thought about a couple of different ways that we could approach this, but maybe we start this one with the assumption that the weekend was spent digesting the Republican National Convention and that Trump is still alive. I mean, I guess that's a decent assumption at this point, although who knows what may or may not have gotten into his ear wound over the weekend. I don't want to speculate on such things. Besides, it's sickening enough that we have to deal with the Republican National Convention and its aftermath. J.D. Vance picked as vice president, so lots of picking over of his record, lots of things to review in that sense, and one of them, at the very least, I can bring to you now. Now that we know who the pick is, and we have our choice of who to read about that pick. So I think it's still relevant to start reading the stories about J.D. Vance and people digesting the fact that he's going to be on the Republican ticket. And one of the great places to start all the time, for any reason, is with David Roth. How about that? David Roth, writing at defector.com, Donald Trump selects his wingman. I saw this one come highly recommended on social media. And so here we are. First things first, he says, Donald Trump's selection of Ohio Senator J.D. Vance as his vice presidential candidate on Monday evening is significant. The office itself is insignificant by its nature, and doubly so to Trump himself, who historically extends the sort of care to the people that make themselves subservient to him that most people reserve for single-use plastics. Vance himself, who may in fact be a single-use plastic, but Vance himself, who is a greasily servile striver even by the standards of his diseased cohort of sociopathic Yaleys, is insignificant as well. He's a suck-up, mostly a dress shirt taken straight out of the packaging and stuffed to bursting with familiar antique bigotries and exhausting contemporary reaction industry cynicisms. He is readily identifiable as an adult convert to Catholicism at 100 paces. Ooh, my goodness. No real thought went into the selection. I believe I had said that it was an extremely online pick, just sort of the most obvious choice that Trump, who gets all his news online, might have made. But no real thought went into the selection, although it feels redundant to point that out, given the parties involved. You know who the party would be, right? Trump. Trump has long seemed unsure of what a vice president might be for. The most obvious answer would never occur to him. Whatever might happen to the world after he leaves it is everyone else's problem. And on that specific issue, you almost have to hand it to him. But of course, you never really do. To the extent that Trump's personal opinion of Vance is known at all, it is that he thinks he is a, quote, handsome son of a bitch, which he really isn't, quite honestly. But there you have it. That Vance is good at sucking up to Trump is not really surprising, given that he has built a career, sort of, I mean, what there is of it, around doing that. If it is probably a challenge to burp up a appreciative laughter and meaningful "so true, sirs" at Trump's material, musty stand-up gags about Diet Coke and doomy skeins on the invading brown hordes, delivered in the same register and whatever order strikes him, is also one that Vance has been practicing for his whole life. What Trump actually thinks of Vance doesn't really matter either, although it seems fair to guess that Trump identified in Vance, who worried in 2016 that Trump could be America's Hitler, and has since done an ultra-unctuous 180 in his opinion of either Trump or Hitler, could be either one, a shamelessness that could come in handy down the line. Dave writes some very complicated sentences, in case you haven't noticed. Trump surely noticed that Vance has some very rich patrons among Silicon Valley's community of increasingly reactionary adult libertarians. These two goofs belong together insofar as they are both crushingly status conscious and gnarled by vanity and grievance in ways that are entirely hilariously unsympathetic. Only a supremely unhealthy culture could have produced either man. It is honestly pretty effing wild that both can be so profoundly monstrous, so eat-the-world vicious, and so annihilatingly petty and vengeful, while also remaining so uninteresting. They are flotsam from different eras of American reaction. Trump, a sea-burnished knob of gilded plastic from a 1985 New Year's Eve party at which more than one person drowned, and Vance, a creature that evolved to live near the sulfuric ocean floor money vents that sustain conservatism, carried up from those depths and cast, worryingly translucent and grasping and very hungry, upon some scandalized Connecticut shoreline. Tides will carry them in or out, but it is their nature to keep showing up. They could not really have a relationship. That reflects their damage, but also that of the movement they represent. Their dynamic with the broader world allows for only enemies and patrons, and they live to destroy the former and will happily destroy themselves for the latter. Most Americans fall into that first category. It is the business of the industry that covers all this to make it seem like something other than what it is, and in that industry's terms, it is significant that Trump chose Vance. Or anyway, it is as significant in roughly the same way that it was significant when Adam Schefter reported last March that the New York Jets were actively working to reach an agreement with Packers free agent wide receiver Alan Lazard, per league sources. Why is that important? I don't know. That was obviously not important, but it was something not yet known that was newly becoming knowable, and so therefore news. Sort of. But it was more than that, something kind of like gossip, and also something even less interesting than that. There was just nothing much to it. It was an institution that had, for lack of any better idea, pegged its fortunes to a volatile, narcissistic, rapidly deteriorating, famous person publicly shopping for a playmate that their difficult, chosen protagonist might at least tolerate. That is not a very meaningful or interesting thing, really, but also, which playmate? There were other considerations. What that playmate might offer, relative to the other available options at that price point. But fundamentally, the stakes were pretty low, both because of the roles involved and because a pacifier is finally just a pacifier. It might be a well-reviewed model. It might have a USB-C port in it for some reason, or just lower in latent heavy metals than expensive ones. But it is a thing to buy and throw out, and whose purpose in the time in between is more or less to be spat onto the floor whenever the mood moves the person who actually matters. Lazard was targeted 49 times and caught 23 passes last year, none of them thrown by his former Green Bay teammate Aaron Rodgers, whose arrival preceded and precipitated Lazard's, and who got injured moments into the team's first game. Vance has spent the last 2 nights sitting in a box near Donald Trump, both of them pursing their lips and pretending to pray and clapping when it was time to do those things. It's tempting to write something like, "It's a living" here, but that's not quite right. The jobs aren't the same. Back to Lazard or Lazard. I don't even know who we're talking about here. Lazard, like everyone else that plays his position, is only as effective as his quarterback lets him be. It's not an equal relationship, but it is a symbiotic one. Vance is just as dependent on his vile patrons, but servile enough to revel in it. There is nothing Vance actually wants or believes that is important enough to him that he will not instantly replace it with the preferences of the elite creeps that have sponsored him along his rise. From the conservative connector and Yale Law School professor Amy Chua, or Yale Law, Amy Chua, to the passel of unsettling Silicon Valley donkeys that handed Vance his venture capital sinecure and promised millions to Trump's campaign after his selection. It is not just his work, but something like the essence of the man himself that Vance is so eager to do whatever is necessary to ingratiate himself with this diseased and disastrous cohort. On the merits, the movement is a sham and its policies are pure curdled kitsch. Vance made his name with a memoir trading an ancient, acidly cynical conservative pablum about values, then smoothly pivoted to the speed-addled futuristic Caesarism of his latter-day Silicon Valley patrons. As that super class of rich freaks grew darker, as they stopped seeing the majority of Americans as insignificant and began seeing them as something less than human, Vance changed his coloration in lockstep. There are various scrims draped haphazardly over this, some stuff about tradition and working people, and the old stuff about values and faith. But all of it is transparently false. None of it fits together or has to. The lack of effort that Vance has put into his more populist gestures as an elected official, which amount to conflating working class values with his parties and his paymasters, musty bigotries, and advocating for toothless alternatives to unions, is as obviously insulting as the policies themselves. The cosmetic efforts Vance puts into trying to address the social problem he lavishes over in Hillbilly Elegy are somehow even more so. Once again, Vance isn't in any kind of vanguard here. American conservatism as an intellectual movement is just like this. It is incoherent because it can afford to be, but also because it has never really been about anything but the rich mediocrities who bankroll it, keeping what they have. There is no intellectual or ethical foundation upon which to build. There is nothing that is actually trying to do beyond make it impossible for anything ever to be different. In the same way that the promise of Trump has always been to wind the clock backwards and then stop it in place, and in the same way that the ongoing conservative judicial power grab has always been about finding ways to make affirmative change not just impossible but illegal, Vance's gambit has always been to affirm that everything that is right. That the people stifled and suffering under all this, which he alternately claims and disclaims as his people in his memoir and public persona, deserve all that suffering and more, and the lazily vicious rich people to whom he has spent his life sucking up deserve all that they have and more. His inauthenticity is the only identifiably authentic thing about him. And it unlocks every other thing worth understanding about the man. There isn't an ideology to find here, but there is a lesson about how deep these idle urges go and how far they might be followed and how fast a sufficiently servile follower can rise and how terrifyingly significant even the most howlingly insignificant person might become. Well, That was about 650 extra words, but we get the point. Very interesting. Good reaction. Good to have as a review as we head into the first full week of his official nomination for Vice President of the United States on the Republican ticket. So, on the assumption that we have spent the weekend perhaps still debating or at least discussing the idea that perhaps Joe Biden might not head the ticket heading into November, because it really seems like what Greg had to say about the subject on Thursday of last week was that there was still gas in the tank for this idea, and a lot of it. So, based on the assumption that that's still under consideration, and we still haven't decided what to do, I thought now would be a good time to have Darwin chime in with a piece he recorded for us the other day about Vice President Harris's appearance at the Essence Festival down in New Orleans, and essentially a good idea now to check in with the extraordinarily level-headed and pragmatic and reliable community of black women and what they have to say about the idea of any change on the ticket, particular changes on the ticket or that may be made to the ticket, and how they view such things. This would be a good time to start checking in if we're still debating this stuff come Monday, which is, of course, now. So you tell me. Darwin?
Hi there, Kagro. Hi there, KITM family. Senior Black Correspondent Darwin Darko here. The headline pretty much sums it up, so let's dive right into it. Black women are squarely behind the Biden-Harris ticket. On the ground at the Essence Festival of Culture, Black women spoke with clarity and pragmatism about what they will do at the ballot box, even as they voiced concern about the uncertainty they see around them. For Black women, there is perhaps no happier place on earth than the Essence Festival of Culture in New Orleans. The annual gathering, now in its 30th year, is one of the largest of Black women in the country, which makes it among the largest gatherings of a loyal and consistent political voting bloc. The Black women I talked to last weekend at Essence were not happy with the talk of Democrats abandoning President Joe Biden or Vice President Kamala Harris, who came to the festival on Saturday and laid out the stakes of the 2024 election to a packed room of cheering attendees. They told me they support the Biden-Harris ticket, chafed at any mention of getting rid of Harris in any capacity, and remained squarely focused on former President Donald Trump as a threat to democracy. And yet, in the days since Biden's disastrous debate performance sparked waves of speculation about what was next for his political career, Black women, including Harris, were initially marginalized from the national conversation about if and how Democrats win in November. On the ground, Black women spoke with clarity and pragmatism about what they will do at the ballot box, even as they voiced concern about the uncertainty they see around them. Here's a quote. Black women are not in a position, nor are we willing to allow the unthinkable to happen, said Jotaka Edie, founder of hashtag Win with Black Women, a collective started during the 2020 election in part to publicly counter racist and sexist attacks against Black women in politics. Another quote, in these hypothetical conversations, we are not ever going to sit by and watch a scenario in which the person the president has chosen as his governing partner is left out of the conversation. That's a non-negotiable for Black women, end quote. Harris's stop at Essence was part of a month-long focus on Black women voters that included a keynote address to the national convening of her sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha, in Dallas on Wednesday, and Black sorority Zeta Phi Beta's national convening in Indianapolis on July 24th. As she took to the stage in New Orleans on Saturday, Essence CEO Carolyn Wanga opened their interview by asking her, who is Kamala Harris? The Vice President of the United States, Harris confidently responded as the crowd roared. It's an answer that seemed to bear repeating. Harris was among Biden's staunchest and swiftest defenders after a poor performance at the first presidential debate of the 2024 cycle on June 27th. Nervous, mostly white Democrats began raising questions about Biden's age and capacity to continue as the party's nominee and some called for him to step aside. But some of the early talk of potential successor routinely skipped over the sitting vice president. In the last few days, as Harris has entered the conversation, familiar criticisms of her leadership, readiness, and ability to effectively message to and connect with voters has resurfaced. She is frequently referred to simply as Kamala by the press and was called the first DEI president in a recent New York Post editorial and by a GOP congressman. The narrative that has swirled around the vice president resonates with Black women, said Belinda Carr, president of Higher Heights for America PAC, an organization focused on supporting Black women as voters, candidates, and elected officials. If the president and vice president were two white males, there wouldn't be this strong discussion about who could or should be selected in the political process if the president has decided not to move forward, Carr said. Harris has run, won, and governed at every level, including sitting steps away from the Oval Office, she continued. She continues to show up every day doing the job of the vice president. She has checked all of those boxes. We're going to be very aware of how people continue to talk about her in this moment, about her readiness to lead, her qualifications, her experience. On stage at Essence, there was no mention of the debate debacle. Instead, Harris pointed to Trump's recent criminal conviction and the Supreme Court ruling that declared former presidents have immunity for official acts. As proof, he should not be elected to a second term in the White House. She also focused on highlighting the administration's record on student loan debt forgiveness, work to remove medical debt from credit reports, and efforts to address the maternal mortality health crisis, all issues disproportionately impacting Black women. And as she asked for their votes in November, Harris also spoke directly to the audience about the power of Black women to make change. Quote, "Ambition is a good thing," Harris told the crowd. "It is good to know one's power and then go for what you want, knowing you can achieve it. You do not need to step quietly," end quote. Black women have gotten louder and become a large part of the 2024 conversation in recent days. At Essence, two Black women who are among the highest profile members of the Congressional Black Caucus publicly affirmed their support for the Biden-Harris ticket. "People are talking about it. Biden is too old. Hell, I'm older than Biden," one person said. 85-year-old Democratic Rep. Maxine Waters of California told the cheering crowd Saturday ahead of Harris's remarks, "I get up every morning and I exercise and I work late hours. I want to tell you, no matter what anybody says, it ain't going to be no other Democratic candidate. It's going to be Biden, and we better know it." Representative Joyce Betty, an Ohio Democrat and former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, enthusiastically praised Harris and her support for the ticket. "We got a Black vice president of the United States of America," Betty said. "I know who I am supporting. I know who I am voting for. I'm going to continue with Biden-Harris team because we're going to have a sister to still be in the White House, fighting for us and making a difference," end quote. Black women are pragmatic, but they also aren't blind. When I asked them about the debate, they acknowledged that Biden didn't perform well, but were also alarmed by Trump's stream of lies. Many Black Americans, including women, see the stakes of the election as existential and believe that Biden and Harris have fought and will fight for them in the White House as they watch Republicans attempt to undermine Black women's leadership and efforts to expand diversity, equity, and inclusion. Black women know Biden is old, but they say he was old 4 years ago when they voted for him, and they feel comfortable voting for him again because they believe he has a capable vice president who is ready to lead if he cannot continue. Over 3 days in New Orleans, I met dozens of Black women with a sense of urgency about the election for themselves, their families, and their communities. Around the issues they care about, reproductive rights, democracy, the economy, education, climate change, and more. They plan to vote and to make the case to the Black men or young voters in their lives who may be skeptical about participating in the election for why they should vote too. Their vote in November will not only be about Biden or Harris's power, but about their own. This article is written in the 19thnews.org. The 19th is an independent nonprofit newsroom reporting on gender, politics, and policy. And the 19th is definitely a reference to the 19th Amendment. Well, thanks for listening, and thanks for the platform, David. Back to you.
Thanks, Darwin. Hey, that has got me thinking And I assume we've all done some thinking perhaps about it over the weekend. Again, this is really difficult to predict what's going to happen and to do these shows ahead of time. This is the worst possible topic for it, I suppose, but an extremely important one. So we're just going to have to give it a go. One thing I will say is that as much as I've been very cautious about the idea of if they were going to make a change with Biden, that it really had to be Harris who steps in, I will say this. We've just gone over the fact that black women voters, the super engaged black women voters that would be at the Essence Festival, etc., or watching closely what goes on there, or just watching closely what goes on in politics, the attribute that we really have to focus on here is their pragmatism, such that we should be saying it is possible that if they become convinced of the necessity of it, and they become convinced of the wisdom of it and the practicality of it, and they find some other candidate acceptable, that will work. That can work, I guess is what I should say. And that they may very well be solidly behind him or her, no matter who they are. Even up to and including saying, well, we know what's at stake, and this 50th white male will be the person we will back at the polls, independent of who might be in the vice presidential slot. They know what's at stake, maybe even more clearly than anybody else. So it is entirely possible that they might accept a bigger change than simply swapping Harris for Biden. I don't know. It's hard to say, but if that's their most defining attribute, and I mean, it has been because it has been out of necessity, and at some point, I am sure they will get frustrated, and that point has already been reached, but they may just be doing the work that needs to be done anyway to survive, to keep on going. But eventually the point will be reached. Why are we always being asked to wait? But I don't know. I mean, I guess if anybody's got to be sick of hearing this is the most important election of our lives, well, I think we're all pretty sick of hearing that one, actually. But they've certainly taken the message to heart in the past and produced some pretty serious results, including the presidency of Joe Biden. So I want to put that out there. This may all be out the window by the time this program airs, but I thought my hope is that you take this as giving them still more credit than we just have given them with Darwin's reporting and reporting in the past just how strong they are behind Democratic tickets and have been behind Democratic tickets since forever. Hate to ask you to do it one more time, but at the same time, I think this is the future that we're facing with the Republican Party. We're going to have, I don't know how long we can keep up the idea of having an existential test every single time, but I don't see it getting any better from the Republican side. But we may have to charge one more time into the breach here. So in my search for evergreen stories that would make good material for a week off and these sorts of special broadcasts, I have socked away this piece, actually fairly recent, from ProPublica, or ProPublica, as we like to pronounce it now these days, that I thought about sharing with you during one of the regular shows and said, oh, no, actually, this looks like exactly the sort of thing that I'd want to use for an evergreen type story. Okay. Well, at any rate, I thought I'd read you this piece from ProPublica from, what's the date? It's July 16th. School vouchers were supposed to save taxpayer money. Instead, they blew a massive hole in Arizona's budget. Well, what a surprise. I know in our own treatment of the school voucher idea over the past couple of years, we have mentioned in the past that, one, that we didn't think they were particularly likely to work, at least not in terms of saving anybody any money. But the theory on which school vouchers were originally based was, well, let's look at how much money schools or school systems, public school systems, are spending per student now, and we'll take that money and give that money or some portion of that money to people going to private schools instead and see if we get better results from them. But the idea was always supposed to be, well, mathematically, they definitely will save money, because if we take the amount of money we're spending in a public school and give that or less to people as vouchers, then that or less will be being spent on education for kids in this jurisdiction. But guess what? Like everything else, that kind of dumb stuff just doesn't work out. It's the sort of thing that, well, this is kind of, I guess, what makes the idea of doing a federal budget as a kitchen table exercise stupid and useless. And guess what? It is stupid and useless, and it's a terrible comparison. And as a result, you get the wrong answer very frequently. And here we do have exactly that. Eli Hager writes this for ProPublica, along with this subheader introduction. Arizona, the model for voucher programs across the country, has spent so much money paying private schoolers tuition that it's now facing hundreds of millions in budget cuts to critical state programs and projects. Whoops, can't believe that this project ended up undermining the entire public sector, not just public education. I'm sure that wasn't the plan. And here's how the article goes. In 2022, Arizona pioneered the largest school voucher program in the history of education. Under a new law, any parent in the state, no matter how affluent, could get a taxpayer-funded voucher worth up to tens of thousands of dollars to spend on private school tuition, extracurricular programs, or homeschooling supplies. Oh, by the way, I don't think I wanted to remind everybody also of one of the holes in this theory, which seemed to me like, well, kind of simple economics, right? That if you have successfully operating private schools that are doing a good job, I guess, allegedly, that's the whole basis, doing a good job imparting an education to their students, but doing so in exchange for usually pricey tuition. If they're a successful business to start with, not only just successful as an educational model, but a successful business, that means they've priced their stuff more or less right, and people are paying that price in exchange for this allegedly better education. If you were to make vouchers available to everyone in the state, then what, economically speaking, might a successful operation, a going concern as a private school do? If their tuition was $10,000 and they were extracting from people $10,000 out of pocket in exchange for their higher quality education already, and then you gave everybody a $10,000 voucher, why wouldn't the school, as a rational economic decision maker, raise its tuition to $20,000? Exactly the same subset of the population would be able to pay $10,000 out of pocket, plus they would get another $10,000 for free from the government, and exclude all the people who thought, oh, I now have a $10,000 voucher that I can use to send my kid to the $10,000 a year private school. No, you can't, because tuition just went to $20,000. Because that's what keeps the school in stasis. Now, they may want to grow their enrollment. They may find they don't think they can get away with a $10,000 increase, but maybe a $5,000 increase. They may say, we'd like to expand our campus. Although in order to do that and accommodate all these new students who could now go there for free, I imagine they would have to invest an awful lot of money, and they may need that other $10,000 from everybody else, or some portion of it. Anyway, that was what always occurred to me about vouchers. We'll see whether any of that comes up. But as it stands, Eli Hager actually has a coherent piece put together here, and we should just stick to that for the moment. But we can't do that here. So where were we? Yes, in just the past 2 years, nearly a dozen states have enacted sweeping voucher programs similar to Arizona's Empowerment Scholarship Account System, with many using it as a model. Oh no. And now they've found out that it blew a hole in their budget. I guess many states will be finding that hole in their budget as well. Yet in a lesson for these other states, Arizona's voucher experiment has since precipitated a budget meltdown. Not just a meltdown. The state this year faced a $1.4 billion budget shortfall, much of which was a result of the new voucher spending, according to the Grand Canyon Institute, a local nonpartisan fiscal and economic policy think tank. Last fiscal year alone, the price tag of universal vouchers in Arizona skyrocketed from an original official estimate of just under $65 million to roughly $332 million, the Grand Canyon analysis found. Another $429 million in costs is expected this year. As a result of all this unexpected spending, alongside some recent revenue losses, it's a link here. I don't know what the revenue losses were, but Arizona is now having to make deep cuts to a wide swath of critical state programs and projects, the pain of which will be felt by average Arizonans who may or may not have school-age children. Of course, the other alternative is for them to say, this proves that state involvement in education is a loser top to bottom, and we're closing the whole thing down. Maybe that was even the original idea. Among the funding slashed, $333 million for water infrastructure projects in a state where water scarcity will shape the future, and tens of millions of dollars for highway expansions and repairs in congested areas of one of the nation's fastest growing metropolises, Phoenix and its suburbs. Also nixed were improvements to the air conditioning in state prisons, where temperatures can soar above 100 degrees. Arizona's community colleges, too, are seeing their budgets cut by $54 million. So good job on the education front. Still, Arizona-style universal school voucher programs, available to all, including the wealthiest parents, could continue to sweep the nation from Florida to Utah. It's not really the nation, but it's a good example of dumb places where dumb stuff might happen. All right, and some of you are in Florida and Utah, but I suspect you know how dumb your states actually are, and who isn't dumb within them. In Florida, one lawmaker pointed out last year that Arizona's programs seemed to be having a negative budgetary impact. A smart state legislator. Wow. This is what Arizona did not anticipate, said Florida Democratic Representative Robin Bartleman during a floor debate. What is our backup plan to fill that budget hole? Interesting that they should bring up the backup plan idea, because that's another of my constant thoughts about programs like this. You do something that burns the whole educational system to the ground and then say, well, can't be repaired. Oh, well, there's just very often no way back. The Republican version of the policy burns all the bridges back and then says, well, I guess there's just not going to be that thing anymore. Her concern was minimized by her Republican colleagues. I can't believe it. And Florida's transformational voucher legislation soon passed. So I guess this disaster, too, coming for Florida. Or rather, this disaster, too, coming for Florida, too. So there's plenty of disasters coming for Florida. This is just one of them. Advocates for Arizona's Universal Voucher Initiative had originally said that it wouldn't cost the public. It might even save taxpayers money. The Goldwater Institute, a conservative think tank that helped craft the state's 2022 voucher bill, claimed in its promotional materials at the time that the vouchers would save taxpayers thousands per student, millions statewide. Families that received the new cash, the Institute said, would be educating their kids for less than it would cost taxpayers if it were in the public school system. They sold it just like we said. But as it turns out, the parents most likely to apply for these vouchers are the ones who were already sending their kids to private school or homeschooling. They used the dollars to subsidize what they were already paying for. And that doesn't even include the possibility that these schools might raise their tuition if they find out that those other schlubby students are starting to be able to afford our tuition. The result is new money coming out of the state budget. After all, the public wasn't paying for private school kids' tuition before, but now it is. And on top of all of the money they're spending on public education, after all. How did they not see this coming? Chris Cotterman, Director of Governmental Relations for the Arizona School Boards Association, says that Arizona making vouchers available to children who had never gone to public school before wasn't realistically going to save the state money. I love that economic argument. Well, we'll take the amount, like we said, like we explained at the beginning, we'll take the amount of money that we're spending per student in public schools and make it available as a voucher, and then either make it that amount or less, and that way we'll definitely be saving money. The math says if we're spending this much per student now and we only spend that much per student, well, then we're saving money. Well, yeah, but then you have a category error that you make after that. If I'm spending $10,000 a year on public education per student for public education, and then I say, well, what if I add $9,000 per student for private education? Well, won't that be more? Won't I have spent $9,000 per student more than I was spending before? Yes, but what if they all switch to private education? But what if they don't? Oh. But why wouldn't they? It's a free private education. Is it? And do they want it? And would the tuition stay the same if everybody started moving, or at least had the ability to move into private education? Would tuition stay the same? I don't know. You don't know. But a pretty good guess would be not everybody is going to move from public school to private school. And if they don't, then we're paying for both. And that would be something that economists call, it's a very complicated situation, but that would be more money. It would, the term of art is cost more. I know, economics, higher economics, a very difficult subject to grasp, but $10,000 per student plus $9,000 per student outside the system is $19,000 if you have two of them, whereas it was $10,000 before. Well, you tell me. Anyway, so now we go into the explanation part of this. Yes, Chris Cotterman, Director of Governmental Relations for the Arizona School Boards Association, says it wasn't realistic. Say that my parents had been gladly paying my private school tuition because that's what was important to them, that I get a religious education. Not necessarily religious, but in this case, let's say that's what happens. That's completely fine, Cotterman said. But when the state said, oh, we'll help you pay for that, and when they did that, well, there's just no disputing that that costs the state more money, he said, critiquing the claims of the Goldwater Institute and others who'd averred that this program and ones like it around the country would not be costly. That's not how a budget works. That's right. And I think somewhere we have some sound in that. Chris Cotterman, if they do something like that, is that how a budget works?
That is not how this works!
Okay. Thank you for clearing that up for us. But you could remember, we're trying to tone down the rhetoric. Okay. Thank you very much. So we move on to the next section, inspiring a national movement. Whoops. Oh no. Everybody's state is going to collapse. What do you know? And luckily we don't want that as Republicans. Heading into this fall, which will bring both a new school year and an election that stands to remake American education and everything else, by the way, ProPublica is going to be examining the complexities, lessons, and failures of the nation's first universal school voucher program as a model for where the whole system seems to be headed. That would be like economic modeling or something like that. Arizona's program, quote, set the standard nationally, unquote, and, quote, inspired a national movement, unquote, according to leading voucher advocacy groups. It is the quote, the nation's school choice leader, unquote, per the longtime conservative columnist George Will. Well, that answers that. For decades, voucher initiatives, including in Arizona, had only served small subsets of students. Often eligibility was limited to certain poor students from failing public schools whose families could use a voucher to switch them into a potentially better private school. And that never really worked either, but then rich people got jealous. Can't I become richer from this? Why are you giving those people benefits? Anyway, in Arizona, for example, back when they had the other program, vouchers as of 2011 were available solely to students with disabilities to make sure that their families could afford a range of personalized education options. The program was then expanded to students who had lived in foster care and to Native American students before gradually the money started going disproportionately, all of a sudden, to wealthier households. Started out like it was well intended, I guess. May never have worked, but okay. Because these measures were initially narrow in scope, some studies found that they had no negative impact on state and local budgets. Studies that voucher advocates continued to cite even as states started considering providing vouchers to every parent who wanted one, which is far more costly an undertaking. As I'm reading it, though, by the way, I am starting to think about the number of times where we, as progressives, might advocate a universal program without regard to means as a money-saving possibility. That is, first saying things like, I guess more relatively low-cost things like free school lunches, like that. But there, the argument is the amount of money spent policing eligibility is just a total loss. You'd actually end up spending more money limiting the eligibility for the program and policing eligibility and paying for lunches for those who qualify than you would just simply giving all lunches to all the kids who qualify. The total program cost is less versus the total program of a restricted program. If you had economics, if you had a model that showed that unrestricted vouchers cost less than restricted vouchers, that would be something. But all they did over at the Goldwater Institute was say, well, this is the pricing model and the cost model for a restricted program. So surely an unrestricted program would also cost nothing. Well, would it? Build it and have a look. No? Oh, okay. Well, then probably not a great claim. If you had something that said that the program costs in total would be less, I don't know how you would build that model, but if you had one, at least you could point to it. But they didn't even bother doing that. All right. So where were we with this? Universal voucher efforts, beginning with Arizona's Universal Empowerment Scholarship Account Program in 2022, allow parents to spend public money not just on private school tuition, but also on recreational programs for their kids like ninja warrior training. You know, there's a huge demand these days in the ninja sector. So this is really more of a vocational training thing than anything else. Trampoline park outings, which again, there's a shortage of trampolines, and we're hoping some of our students will grow up to become trampolines. Ski passes. Well, that's just fun. And also on toys and home goods that they say they need for homeschooling purposes. And you might for preschoolers. You know, you never know. The average ESA award, by the way, roughly $7,000. That's a lot of skiing and trampolining. In a statement to ProPublica, a spokesperson for Arizona's former Republican Governor Doug Ducey, who signed the Universal Voucher Program into law and then I guess took off forever, said that not only does Governor Ducey have no regrets about ESA expansion, but he doesn't care because he's out of office and he's having margaritas in a hammock. Or rather, I'm sorry, that doesn't say that. It says not only does Governor Ducey have no regrets about ESA expansion, he considers it one of his finest achievements and a legacy accomplishment. And what he's most thrilled about is that Arizona's ESA expansion was followed by 11 other states doing essentially the same thing. Arizona helped set off an earthquake. Well, that's true. Voucher proponents have long pointed out that private school parents have a right to and could be sending their children to public school at taxpayer expense. So providing them with what is often a smaller amount of taxpayer money in the form of a voucher to help them pay private school tuition is, the argument goes, a net savings for the public. This is similar to arguing that the public should help pay for car drivers' gas because if they didn't drive, they might use public transportation instead, which would be a cost to taxpayers. Yeah, pretty unlikely on that one. Anyway, Ducey's spokesperson, Daniel Scarpinato, I think I got that right, did not acknowledge, what am I saying? Of course he didn't acknowledge. He did not acknowledge that the net cost of universal voucher programs has been far higher than voucher supporters originally promised. Instead, he reiterated that, quote, universal ESA costs are basically revenue neutral, unquote. He's off by about $350 million. The reasoning, overall enrollment in Arizona public schools has been slightly down ever since many parents withdrew their kids during the pandemic, creating some savings in the education budget that could be seen as offsetting the new voucher spending. But I guess it's not. Ducey, as well as Matt Beienberg, that's Beienburg. Okay. He's the Goldwater Institute's Director of Education Policy. Well, the two of them together blamed Arizona's budget crisis on current Democratic Governor Katie Hobbs, pointing out that she signed a 2023 budget that spent down what was then a surplus instead of keeping the money in reserve for a possible moment like this. But, if your program blows a $300 million hole in the budget, well, you spent the surplus. Well, the surplus wasn't $300 million. And also, why is there a hole in the budget? But okay, the 2023 budget, though, was passed with bipartisan support, it notes parenthetically. Ducey did not answer a question about whether he'd had a long-term plan to pay for ballooning voucher spending beyond relying on that one-time surplus, right? So the surplus is gone. Now how are you going to pay for it? Oh. Well, but she spent the surplus. Yeah, but you were going to spend the surplus. Shut up. Go away. In an email, Beienberg maintained that Arizona's current budget mess wasn't caused by the vouchers. He blamed, among other issues, state revenue recently being lower than anticipated. You mean taxes? Tax revenue? We stole less from the hardworking men and women of Arizona like you wanted? Yeah. I don't know. Well, the Goldwater Institute in 2021, it's noted here, collaborated with Ducey to write and pass tax cuts that reduced income taxes on the wealthiest Arizonans to 2.5%, the same rate that the poorest people in the state pay, which is the leading cause for that decline in revenue. Who could believe it? Dave Wells, research director at the Grand Canyon Institute, said that none of the competing budget trends that Ducey and the Goldwater Institute pointed to mean that Arizona can actually afford universal vouchers, at least not without making severe, harmful budget cuts. They chose to make ESAs universal, and that has made the budget situation much worse, he said. We still had a budget shortfall and budget cuts. The cost is still the cost. And look at what they did here. Isn't this interesting? Everyone should be equal. Everyone should have equal access to vouchers, whether you are wealthy or not. And everyone should pay the same rate in income tax, whether you're wealthy or not. 2.5% income tax for everybody, rich or poor, and $7,000 in the mail for, if you ask for it, if you can make a claim to it, for educational expenses, whether you need it or not. And what has happened with that? Gigantic hole in the budget. Who could have predicted? I don't know. People with math skills? Economists? Anybody? Okay. Anyone with a kitchen table, perhaps? Next section, it isn't funded. Now that vouchers in Arizona are available even to private school kids who have never attended a public school, there are no longer any constraints on the size of the program. What's more, as the initiative enters its third year, there are no legislative fixes on the table to contain costs, despite Hobbs's efforts to implement some reforms. I have not heard them agree to anything that is a financial reform of the program at all, said Senator Mitzi Epstein, the Democratic minority leader of the state Senate, referring to her Republican colleagues. And what would they come up with? If only private business had some suggestions about whether or not you should incentivize people who are already customers or whether you want to be incentivizing new customers. I mean, how frequently do you get some special offer for new subscribers only? Well, all the time. But, something, run it like a business, yada, yada, yada. I don't know. Anyway, Arizona doesn't have a comprehensive tally of how many private schoolers and homeschoolers are out there. Why would they count? They're only trying to budget for them. So it remains an open question how much higher the cost of vouchers could go, and therefore how much cash should be kept on hand to fund them. That's, by the way, I would think you would want to have that information. Like if the objective reality is, let's say that there are 100,000 public school students in Arizona. I have no idea. I imagine it's in the millions, but let's say that there are 100,000 of them in the state, public and private alike. And information comes in, now you have a $300 million hole in the budget and you're looking at a $450 million hole in the next budget. And you say, what's weird is that there have been claims made for $7,000 vouchers for 111 million students in this state. And I just, I think something might be wrong with that. We want to maybe audit this. How is it, they're screaming their heads off all the time. There were more ballots cast than there were something, yada, yada. That they're looking at. There are more vouchers being issued than there are students in the state. I don't know whether that's the case. I don't know, but you can't know if you don't know how many students there are in the state. I think they should maybe want to have that information in their back pocket somewhere. Anyway, Arizona doesn't have a comprehensive tally of how many private schoolers there are, so open question how much more they might end up having to spend and how much cash should be kept on hand in order to fund the vouchers that they've committed to. The director of the state's nonpartisan Joint Legislative Budget Committee told lawmakers that, quote, we've never really faced that circumstance before where you've got this requirement that anyone can get a voucher, but it isn't funded. Yeah, right. And so that's why, I said they might decide, let's just scrap the whole education system instead. But for the moment, they're saying, I don't know, well, we might have to scrap all the rest of government. We said anyone could get a voucher. We can't pay for it, but I don't know. I guess we have to because we said that we would. Good planning. Most importantly, said Beth Lewis, executive director of the public school advocacy group Save Our Schools Arizona, only a small amount of the new spending on private schools and homeschooling is going toward poor children, which means that already extreme educational inequality in Arizona is being exacerbated. Oh no, it's almost as if it were exactly the opposite of the stated intention. Can't believe it. But it did come out to the benefit of the wealthy, so I guess I can believe it. The state is 49th in the country in per pupil public school funding, and as a result, year after year, district schools in lower income areas are plagued by some of the nation's worst staffing ratios and largest class sizes. Spending hundreds of millions of dollars on vouchers to keep kids who are already going to private school keep going to private school, to help kids do that. Well, that won't just sink the budget, Lewis said. It's funding that's not going to the public schools, keeping them from becoming what they could and should be. And that, of course, was always and immediately the argument against private school vouchers right from the start. And guess what? That's true, too. So just thought I would add that to the mix. Might be something to keep you going and engaged while I am out touring the west of this beautiful country.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, that takes us to 1 hour on today's special pre-recorded episode of Kagro in the Morning. Time now for you to stay tuned for another hour of entertainment with Justice Putnam and the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy next right here on Net Roots Radio.